It's actually the people that face the problems that do have the solutions. And all we have to do is give them the tools, as I mentioned, and get out of their way a lot of the time.
Stuart is a pioneer and global leader in impact investing, impact entrepreneurship, and the leadership and management strategy known as Profit for Purpose. He is the creator of impact economics, which is the future of business, capitalism, and resilient and inclusive communities. During his career, he has helped create almost $1 billion in realized shareholder value for the companies he started and sold or was an executive at. Stuart is a founder, CEO, chairman, speaker, author, mentor, and board member. In this episode, we talk about how Stuart has pioneered Profit for Purpose and why the greatest accumulation of financial wealth will be amassed by those who create the environmental and social solutions of the future. You're listening to Going Conscious, the podcast where we discover new ways to live a more conscious life of fulfillment and freedom. Each week, I speak with entrepreneurs, academics, and changemakers who have made big transformations, left unfulfilling lives behind, and found meaning in this new world where purpose drives success. Let's get inspired to live our unique journeys to the fullest. Let's explore the impact we want to make and deepen our understanding of ourselves, each other, and this beautiful world around us. Live your freedom. I'm your host, Nikki Trott. In this episode, we talk about the good things about capitalism and how to use business to create a positive impact. How Stuart has challenged global heads of state and leading CEOs to rethink leadership and management. The research and learnings that inspired him to create impact economics and how this method can be used and is already being used to change our world. Why a bottom-up approach works better than top-down. The power of economic vibrancy, why inclusivity is vital to sustainability and the success of humanity, and the desperately needed arrival of the feminine. Now, let's go to our conversation. Hello, Stuart. Welcome to Going Conscious.
Thank you for having me on the show.
I'm really excited to speak with you. I've met Stuart on Clubhouse over the last month or two, and we've been on lots of panels together, and I've been so grateful to have Stuart in many of the rooms that I have created around the topic of conscious entrepreneurship and profit with purpose. And it's been incredible to get to know you. So I'm really looking forward to diving in and having a more detailed one-on-one conversation today, Stuart. So thank you for being here.
Oh, you're very welcome. I'm looking forward to it too.
Yeah, fantastic. Great. Well, I would love to start by asking you just to tell us a little bit about your journey and your path towards conscious work, because you have been pioneering conscious work and impact economics for decades. And this is a conversation that we're all having now, which feels so topical, but I know which you've been driving for such a long time. So I was wondering how you first got into that, and if there was something you were doing beforehand that maybe wasn't so aligned with your values, and then how you might have made that change.
Indeed. So I am in my 50s for some context for you. And when I was in my teens, I was an environmental conservationist. And a dear friend and I started really building some quite large environmental conservation projects in Europe when we were in our early 20s. And we both had day jobs. I was in sort of corporate finance, and Paul was working in a family business. But we, our passion really was environmental conservation. And I think back then it's fair to say that we were young and naive enough to actually believe that people didn't really matter. We had this perception that if there was no planet, there'd be no people. And so our focus was on the planet and the environment, et cetera, et cetera. And it wasn't until one of our biggest benefactors challenged us to find a way to drive positive impact for people through our environmental conservation work that we actually sort of took our heads out of our rear ends and said, oh, okay, really, right. That's probably not a bad idea, especially as we were told that if we could not achieve that, that the funds that were being directed to us for environmental conservation might dry up. And so that was, I think, incentive enough. And we really didn't know where to start, to be honest. And this is now in the sort of late 80s. And so we sat down one day and said, well, what actually constitutes sustainability today? And we did some research, went to a library, of course, no internet back then. And we discovered that there were really four pillars at that time. There was environmental conservation, and that's where we were embedded. There was social change architecture. There was sustainability as it was back then, which was really, even recycling was at its infancy. And then there was this thing that I certainly knew nothing about, and not many people seem to, called SRI, which was socially responsible investing. And that was very, very, very much in its infancy. But we thought that if we could somehow bring those together, and so, for example, as environmental conservationists, could we find ways to embed the other three pillars in our initiatives? We could actually make a difference. And so that's what we tried to do. We started embedding social change architecture and sustainability and socially responsible investing into our environmental conservation projects. Now, what that did was a number of things. Number one, it showed us that when you take a systems approach to something, you can actually exponentially almost increase benefits, not just to your one constituent, which for us at the time was the environment, but for all constituents that are included. We were also able then to suggest that people who were stewarding initiatives led by, for example, social change or led by sustainability do the same thing, which they did, and they got similar results. And of course, that allowed you then to measure which of the four of the legs of the stool had the biggest impact. And it might be no surprise that it was the presence of appropriate capital, this socially responsible investing capital, that actually had the biggest impact. And so by 1990, we had sort of figured that out, and we were successful in driving positive impact in other areas. And it was in 1991, when I was in my 20s, that I actually came to America to start a company in New York City and really begin that journey, Nikki, down that sort of, SRI, ESG, TBL, conscious business journey.
Wow, thank you so much. That's fascinating to hear how you started as an environmentalist and then discovered these pillars and found that actually it was the presence of the appropriate or socially responsible capital that really had the biggest impact. So I'm wondering, how did you then bring that to a business? How did you bring those things together so you could find socially responsible capital and also create a sustainable business that could really make some change in the world?
Yeah, well, I didn't start by starting a sustainable business. I must admit, the business that I started at that time in 1991 was also called SRI, but it stood for Strategic Research Institute. And it became one of the world's leading C-suite business-to-business conference companies, where we were almost like a market research company, actually. But instead of putting the research that we had found into reports and selling them, we invited preeminent leaders from with the niches of the industries that we were researching to come and present the data at conferences. Now, that caused obviously quite an increase in carbon footprint when you have literally tens of thousands of people flying around the world every year to in-person conferences. But of course, there was no internet back then, and there was no email. And realistically, that's the only way that you could convene people. But what it did was it gave me a platform, and a global platform at that, to take a deep dive into this world of what people today call profit for purpose, if you want to call it that. And in doing that, I met this wonderful, wonderful lady. Her name is Susan Davis, and she lives in Ecuador now. And Susan was one of the pioneers of socially responsible investing, along with other remarkable human beings like Hazel Henderson, for example, and Barbara Marx Hubbard, and other people who were really in the 60s having the same kind of conversations that people have, for example, on Clubhouse, or we're having on this podcast today. Needless to say, they didn't have the same technology that we can benefit from, but the conversations were almost identical. And I've been blessed enough to listen to tapes of some of those conversations from that far back. But Susan and I got together and collaborated, and in 1993 launched the conference Making a Profit While Making a Difference in New York City. And by that stage, I was already challenging global heads of state and CEOs of some of the largest companies that you would know, and owners and managers of the world's largest asset pools, to really look at leadership and management through a different lens. And that lens today, of course, is called the lens of profit for purpose. We call it making a profit while making a difference. It's the same thing. It's no different. And the conference actually was quite a watershed, because we actually had Ben and Jerry as our keynote speakers, and it was primarily a finance conference, to be honest with you. And that conference ran for quite some time, but the conference was really the catalyst to launch that platform. And of course, because I had a global conference business, I could now hold conferences on these subjects that were certainly near and dear to my heart, but more importantly, I thought that were really important for society as a whole. And that was the genesis, to be honest with you.
Incredible. Thank you so much. I love how you describe how each of these steps took you to the next one. And you created this business, and you were advising companies and setting up a conference company, and then realized that you could use that platform to bring your own message, which is so important to you and to society, to a much wider audience. And how did you then take that to where you are today with impact economics? We'd love to hear a bit more about that.
So the deeper I took the dive into economics and capital flows around the world and the finance industry, the more I realized that it needed to be edited. I mean, there are a lot of really good things about capitalism. There's a lot of good things about the financial industry, to be quite frank. But of course, there are also some things that don't work. And I was able and had the luxury to, as I traveled, sort of take a deeper look into this. My work in this area, of course, was a passionate hobby, certainly from 1991 through to 2006, when I was blessed enough to sell my company. And we'll get to that in a second. But while I was still running my business, or as I like to say, I had a day job. That day job did put me in a situation where I could have dialogues with people that controlled vast sums of capital and that employed literally millions of people when you add them together. And so those conversations didn't go very well, to be honest with you, at the beginning. I drank lots of nice cups of tea, and I met a lot of really nice people. But I often found myself leaving those meetings being unsuccessful in what I wanted to achieve. And case in point, I spoke at one of our own conferences in, I think it was 1998 or 1999. And we had a panel on SRI, socially responsible investing. And the panelists were euphoric that at that time, 5% of the world's investable assets were being invested using social or environmental screens. And they thought that was a 5% success. And my counter was, well, I actually think it's a 95% failure. So that really didn't go down too well, but that's okay, because we all have different viewpoints, and it certainly caused for some lively debate on the panel. But what that showed me was that the top-down approach was either not going to work, or B, it was going to be too slow. Now, bear in mind, we weren't asking people for the world. What it all boiled down to in a nutshell was make as much money as you want. Nobody really cares. Just do not do it at the expense of any segment of humanity or the planet. And once you can check that box, then make as much money as you want. Nobody really cares. But now do it by driving positive impact, deliberately driving positive impact to segments of humanity or the planet. And I mean, those two statements sound somewhat similar, Nikki, but they're actually light years apart. And so when we looked at the opposite to top down and sort of saw bottom up, we then said, well, how can we go bottom up here? So a group of people started encouraging really young, well, I was young back then, but younger than I, people to innovate solutions that would actually fix social and environmental problems. And they were called social and environmental entrepreneurs. And that's just what we referred to them as. And we were in a sort of advisory board meeting around 2000, may have been 99. And someone said, I'm just so tired of writing down social and environmental entrepreneurs. It's quite a mouthful. And that it was a lady, and she said, can we change the nomenclature here? And, I said, it's not up to me, and I don't call them whatever you want. And someone in the room said, well, we all talk about positive impact, and so why don't we just call them impact entrepreneurs? Well, that seemed sensible, right? So those of us that were investing in those innovations then obviously became impact investors. Now, I'm not claiming for 1 minute to have started the impact investing movement, but that was the first time that I had sort of heard it called that, right? And I was around when that was developed. But certainly wasn't me who developed that nomenclature. I was just happened to be around the people that did. But I do believe that movement, and whoever wants to take credit for it, was the start of the sort of bottom-up movement that began to move the needle much faster than it was being moved by the top-down initiatives, if that helps you.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. So you then found a way that you could work on bottom-up impact and start to really drive change that way.
Yes, we did. We found more people. And I think because when you do top down things, it's very hard to see how you can actually contribute or how can you actually make a difference to a massive system that's become institutionalized. Whereas if you look at it from a bottom up and you're looking at a specific need within your community, that seems more achievable, right? So I think that was one of the things that became an impetus for people to say, well, no, actually, I can do something about this, right? And I can do it either myself or I can do it by putting together a team of like-minded collaborators. And we can do it in our own community. And then if it works, we can scale it. And so I think that was a big part of it. And then, of course, as we were gaining this momentum, we ran right into 9/11. And I, for one, certainly was running a business that was 100% dependent on people's ability or willingness to travel. And quite rightly, both of those things got shut down for a period of time. And then with multiple other business owners also faced, strategic inflection points for their own companies at that time. And so that really kind of stopped the wave for a little bit until we all could figure out, where the world was headed after that travesty. And so it took really until about 2002 for it to start to pick up momentum again, maybe even 2003, if I'm being honest. But once that momentum started, I think that people were beginning to look at life through a different lens. We were just then starting a generational shift at that stage where the Gen X demographic were becoming, business leaders. I mean, in 2002, the eldest Gen X person was almost 40. So I think that transition, that generational shift, also contributed to an expedited rate at which conversations around the world were then springing up, and levels of importance around those conversations started to get significantly higher. And then more people started to take action towards this necessary shift of profit for purpose. That coincided, totally luckily for me, with selling my firm in 2006, which of course gave me the wonderful asset of time and then some capital to really take what was my passion, albeit a hobby up until then, and turn it into a full-time focus.
So how has that then developed? So when you were able to go full time on your passion, really focus on it, how have you then been able to build this impact investing movement? And what are the outcomes of that?
Great question. So after I sold my company, I had to work for the acquirer for a year and a half, and then I took a year off to really think about what it is well, I knew what I wanted to do, but how was I going to do it? And during that year, I went to numerous think tanks and institutions, names that you would know, globally recognized. And the answers I've got, which just left, I mean, they left me felt defeated, because what I saw was people doing the same thing and hoping for a different result. And so I spoke to my family, and we decided that we were going to go and find out for ourselves what the problem was. So in 2009 ish, we took it upon ourselves to go into marginalized communities around the world using focus groups to ascertain from the people themselves that face the majority of the problems what really are the choke points that are preventing any progress. Because when you look at the industry of socioeconomic environmental problem solving, it's been around in its current structure for 60 or 70 years. And many of the problems that we face, the ubiquitous problems that seem to be embedded in most countries in the world, have they not gotten better? They're actually worse, right? So you need to ask yourself, when trillions and trillions of dollars have been donated over that period of time, why can't we move the needle? So we retained a firm that was specialists in focus groups, and they designed a focus group for us where we could have the eldest people in a community that were generally around 80 years of age in one room, and then deliberately have people in their early 20s from the same community in another room. And they were asked the same questions that related to the choke points that they saw as preventing any progress. The only difference, Nikki, was that the octogenarians were asked a second set of questions, which was now think back 50 or 60 years to when you were in your early 20s. And what were the answers then? And once everyone had finished, we brought them into the same room where, waiting for them, we had already invited the local government leaders or municipal leaders, religious leaders, community leaders, business leaders, if there were any, to share the results. And many people in the room were horrified when the results were shown, because the answers from the 80-somethings were almost identical to the answers from the 20-somethings. And if that's not bad enough, even more horrific, the answers from 50 or 60 years ago were almost identical to the answers today. And then what was fascinating to me was that when you were in communities that were sort of, 20,000 miles apart, and there'd been no contact from members of those communities with each other, the answers were also the same. And so that only told you one thing, that not only had we made progress, actually things were worse. But those conversations allowed us to take a deep dive into why. And what we found was that there was no ill intent here, of course, but most innovations or initiatives focused on fixing an effect of something. So, for example, if you see a hungry child, as human beings, of course, we want to feed that child. But if you don't fix the reason the child is hungry, you'll be feeding that person for the rest of their lives. And so, by only focusing on effects and not the cause, it becomes like a terminal disease where it just festers away and you'll never do anything about it. So it's just like putting Band-Aids on it. And in every instance we found, the actual cause was lack of economic vibrancy, which ties back into what you're so passionate about how do we combine commerce and compassion in a way that increases economic vibrancy and treats all shareholders not only with respect, but in a way where we drive positive outcome. So that was one, right? Cause and effect. The other ones were, for example, way too many choke points in the capital flow from the top of the socioeconomic pyramid to the bottom. I'll give you an example for that. In 2018, $440 billion was donated in the United States, and less than 10% of it found its way to the actual innovations, bottom-up innovations that they were intended to fund. So there's a massive choke point there. So that had to be unlocked. We found that not all segments of a community were included in the economic vibrancy model that they were currently adopting. We found that obviously not all residents, therefore, were being included. We found that inclusion actually is what begets equity, and equity in turn begets resiliency, and you can't have anything to be sustainable unless it's resilient. We found that people really did think that they could solve other people's problems, and they can't. We can provide those people with a runway. And what you'll find when you go into communities that are marginalized or disenfranchised is that these people have the solutions themselves. They just need someone to provide them with the knowledge and information and education and tools and contacts and context. And yes, at times, access to appropriate capital, of course, to be able to bring those innovations to life and solve their own problems. And then it's our job, frankly, to just get out of the way and really stand as guards to the entrances to the dead end alleys that through experience we've all been down, preventing them from wasting time and resources and expediting the rate at which that they can bring their innovations to life and impact people. We found that you cannot do it from afar, and we found that you really can't help unless you're in place. So when we looked at all of that and we threw it into this big melting pot and we used our own systems approach for design, that's how we came up with the impact economics model that becomes 100% inclusive of every community segment in a community. It is 100% inclusive of all people. It has initiatives that drive positive impact for all segments, but most importantly, when one segment benefits, all others benefit. And it allows anyone to participate in and personally benefit from contributing to driving a sustainable future. But it still has to be done in place. And so it was all that work and all that research that brought us to the design of impact economics.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. All of those different factors, absolutely fascinating. And so the impact economics model, inclusive of all people, making a positive impact, anyone can participate and contribute to driving a sustainable future. So how does it work? It sounds too good to be true.
Well, as you can probably imagine, it's actually not that complex when it boils down. And sometimes I think it's the best solutions can be quite simple.
Yes.
But in a nutshell, you go into a community, you're in place, you work with the community members there, and you let them actually build their own self-funding organization to take impact economics through a certification program that we have that's on our website. There's also a video on the homepage of our website, Nikki. It's about an hour long, unfortunately, but it does go into depth as to how impact economics works. But primarily, what you do is you take every segment of a community, whether that's educational institutions, students, residents, impact entrepreneurs, impact investors, companies are truly important stakeholders, not-for-profits, the local government, because like it or not, they are stakeholders and very large ones in the community. And you align them in an economic model where you have initiatives that are initially designed where each one benefits, as I mentioned, but those are open source, so other people can insert their great innovations for that specific segment. And what it does is it increases economic vibrancy within that community. And those increases are far more ethically distributed, not in terms of handouts, but in terms of people contributing to the overall betterment of each community segment and therefore the community as a whole. I mean, that's really the bottom line.
If you enjoy Going Conscious, please subscribe for a new episode every Wednesday. If you think your friends and networks would benefit from listening, please share this podcast of fulfillment and freedom with them. And if you listen on Apple Podcasts, please rate and review. It's great to read what you think, and your support makes a big difference. Together, let's grow our courage and tools to transform and live the lives we really want to. As well as creating Going Conscious, I work as a transformation coach and conscious brand consultant. I'm on a mission to help holistically maximize conscious entrepreneurs to drive positive changes for themselves, others, and the planet. I can help you to transition and level up personally, and I can help your brand grow and make a bigger impact. To connect with me and find out more about how we can work together,
and how is it going then? How long have you
Nikki
been
Trott,
rolling out
on my
impact
website,
economics, and
nikkitrott.com.
what impact have you seen
Please get in touch.
having?
I'd love to hear from you.
It's been
and
fantastic.
Let's talk about
so
your
we
path
were
of growth and
invited to go
development.
to Paraguay and test it there, which we did. And then we started the US test in Charleston, South Carolina. And we deliberately said we would test it here for 6 years to ensure that it worked before we offered it to anyone else. And so we did that. And it's been unbelievable. The College of Charleston as an educational institution have been remarkable. The students there, the students in some of the high schools that it's now being dropped down into, the community residents, whether they be from the top, middle, or bottom of the socioeconomic pyramid, are all involved. We have impact entrepreneurs. We've literally grown a real hub of impact entrepreneurship in Charleston through this model. We've got impact investors now in Charleston investing in innovations that are focused on solving problems that are near and dear to their hearts, of course, within their own community. We've got businesses involved. For example, I know you're passionate about this, so I'll spend some time on it. So the way we bring businesses into the model is in a positive light. I, for one, am tired of hearing that business is bad. It's not bad. Yes, are there some people that knowingly make their money at the expense of people or planet, etc.? Yes, there are, but they're actually in the minority. Most business leaders and business owners are actually good people who care about their community. And so we wanted to ensure that we brought every community segment into the model in a positive light. So that meant businesses as well. Now, some people who are very holistic will criticize impact economics because it allows businesses to make more money. But what you'll see in a second is when they make more money, it's not left to happen chance that everyone else benefits. So how did we do that? So we started about 6 years ago designing something called a corporate impact index. And it's an online consulting tool that consists of about 250 questions. And it's broken down into different segments. So how are you impacting your top line, bottom line, gross margin? How are you impacting your brand equity, your brand value? How are you impacting your employees, your supply chain? How are you impacting the community that surrounds you, your environment, etc.? And it's very in-depth. And companies can take this online. It's an online consulting model. And when they've taken it, by the way, we use students to help them go through it online. So we're embedding those students into the business world for internships or, potentially full-time careers when they graduate high school or college. So once they've completed it, they get an impact score for each of the segments, and they get an overall score. Now, if they score 80% and above, there's really not much we can do to help them, right? They're already there. So what we do is we write them their report and we give them some free advice on areas that they may be able to improve a little bit on. And then we tell the local community what a good actor this business is and that you can frequent this company, without any fear of worrying about whether they're, polluting or using child labor or anything else that's important to you. Now, if they don't score 80% or above, the consultants who are certified in impact economics will enter into a consulting assignment if the company wishes to. That consulting assignment is meant to get them to 80% because we've seen that companies that score 80% and above do have the highest and most sustainable revenues and profits. They have the highest brand equity and brand value. They get to hire the best and brightest people, and they have the highest customer and employee retention rates, and they have the biggest positive impact on their community. And they're, and in some cases, working towards the biggest positive impact on the environment. And so it's good for the business. Now, when, as you'll see from the video, if anyone watches it, when the consultant charges, it's based upon that company's revenue, so everyone can participate. But the consultant doesn't see the entire fee, because the consultant requests that the corporation take 15% of whatever the fee would be and make a direct tax-deductible donation to the educational institution. In Charleston, it happens to be the College of Charleston. And that money can only be used to expand the Center of Impact Studies and classes at the college, for example, on impact entrepreneurship, impact investing, leadership and management through the lens of profit for purpose, cause marketing, integrated reporting, et cetera, plus the free community impact entrepreneurship classes that are also part of impact economics, plus the free impact incubator that's also part of impact economics. The consultant also challenges the company, requests from the company, I should say, that an additional 5% of the fee gets donated to a local impact investment fund, or DFA it can be, but it can only be used to help fund innovations that come out of that impact incubator that's being run in the community to bring more impact innovations to life. And so as the company expands, it's actually helping. And of course, by scoring 80%, a lot of work is done with that consulting client to make sure that they are doing whatever they can to positively impact the community, their employees, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, once we've done that with a corporation, we totally understand the DNA of that company. So it's very easy for us to introduce that corporation to a not-for-profit that is stewarding an initiative that aligns with the DNA of the company. Now, that doesn't mean that the company has to make donations at all, but generally speaking, the company will encourage its employees to target their paid and unpaid community service hours for those not-for-profits. And then when we start working with the local government, city, municipal, it doesn't matter, just as there is a corporate impact index, there's a city impact index. But that's over 350 questions, because not only are you certifying that city as an organization, living, breathing organization, you're also certifying it as how does it steward initiatives within its city. And it's very in-depth and very analytical. And again, if they score 80%, great. If not, you can consult with them to get them there. But one of the things that you then do with the city is you work with them to put together an incentive package for any corporations that score 80% or above. But that financial incentive can only be used to hire people from the most marginalized segments of your community, thereby increasing economic vibrancy in those community segments. And it's a great incentive for companies to stay and grow, or actually, if the city has an economic development corporation, to reach out to other companies to come and locate here. And when you combine that with the work that impact economics does in marginalized community segments, in helping those people bring their own innovations to life, to become entrepreneurs, to hire people from within their own community, to release innovations that will help solve socioeconomic environmental problems for themselves, but by the same time increase economic vibrancy, you can begin to see how this rising in economic vibrancy helps across the board. And once you start increasing economic vibrancy, a lot of the effects of either a lack of or no economic vibrancy, things that we see all day, like, hunger, food deserts, gentrification, lack of access to transportation, adequate education, adequate healthcare, over a time, rising economic vibrancy actually starts to naturally eradicate a lot of those problems. So I'm sorry I went on there, but it's a little complicated, but that gives you insight at least.
Yes, amazing. Thank you so much, Stuart. And I'm wondering, how has your life changed as you've made this big change and sold your company and then done all of this work in impact economics? How has it changed your life personally as you've pursued your passion?
Well, it hasn't really. Because I think my passion was embedded for a long time before I was blessed enough to be free to do it full time, if that makes sense. Was I traveling a bit more? Maybe. Was I getting to meet more people? Yes. Um, but I don't think it's changed me as a person because I've been centered around this for so long. One thing it has done is it's opened my eyes to the fact that the people that face the problems are the ones that have the solutions. We tend to sort of sit here sometimes in ivory towers, and I'm going to say it, mentally masturbate over these things and never do anything. When it's actually the people that face the problems that do have the solutions. And all we have to do is give them the tools, as I mentioned, and get out of their way a lot of the time. So it's opened my eyes to that. I have been thrilled over the last probably 5 or 6 years to see an expedited rate at which the growth of this is happening. People like yourself, I wouldn't have met, for example, right? And other people that that are really working with innovators and corporate leaders to really help them understand how they can become more conscious. I'm saying that because it's the title here, right, of the podcast. So, how can they become more conscious in their everyday decision making about building their businesses? And not only about building them, but how do they run them? And I think it's important that they can see that it's not just holistic, right? That there is benefit for all segments of the community and therefore the planet if they actually do adopt leadership and management through the lens of profit for purpose. So, you know, I I was never thinking about retiring anyway, so it hasn't changed me from that standpoint. But I do think it's probably made me more excited, Nikki, that I think in my lifetime, and what have I got left? 40, 50 years? I don't know, maybe something like that if I'm lucky. But I do think now in my lifetime, I will see incredible change. Now, I believe that some of that's going to be driven by generational change, generational shift. I believe it's going to be driven by the fact that the feminine has been rising for centuries and now is arriving into leadership roles. I think that's uber important to balance out the values and virtues of the masculine. So I think there are things that are happening here at a rapid rate that maybe have changed my outlook a little bit from being uber pessimistic to actually being quite optimistic. Because of people like you and others in the world doing this work. But there's one word of warning I will give everyone, that the problem solving industry itself is broken, and it's really broken. And we can keep pointing the finger at, oh, it's capitalism's fault. Oh, we don't have networks. Oh, it's this. Oh, it's that. And the people doing the finger pointing are generally those within the industry of socioeconomic environmental problem solving. But rarely do they want to look internally and say, well, what role is our industry actually playing in not achieving any progress? And oftentimes those problems are hiding in plain sight. And unless we flush them out, and unless we really systemically change this industry of socioeconomic environmental problem solving, I'm fearful that the optimism I have will be unfounded.
Stuart, can you tell us more about the feminine, which you mentioned, which I've loved hearing you talk about, and how the rising of the feminine is so important in your view for how we can change the world?
Yeah, so let's go to the other side of my body, right, which is the sort of holistic side that I too have. So I think it was 324 AD when Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea, where he invited every ecumenical head from the known world to come and decide what would be in the Bible. And one of the things that they decided, of course, they were all men, right? There were no women there. One of the things they decided was to write women of power out of history. And ever since then, I truly believe that women have been oppressed. I mean, for God's sake, you can only vote 100 years ago. I mean, how insane was this, right? So So we've been under the dictate of leadership of the masculine, which is only one part of humanity, for the past 2,000 years, and some will say longer. And I think that's had a really negative effect because we've been out of balance. And I'm not one that thinks that the feminine should rise above the masculine at all, but I do think the feminine should be risen to balance the masculine because we haven't had balance. We've been out of balance. And in my travels, both through business and otherwise, I have absolutely come to the conclusion that women are far more empathetic than men. I think that women listen better than men. There are studies out that show that they're actually better business leaders than men because of the two aforementioned attributes that I just gave you. And so when we look back and say, well, how did we get here? We've only had leadership through the lens of one of the genders. And I think that's problematic. Now, I don't think, I think I'm not sure if I'm a baby boomer or not, but either way, my parents, when they would get up to go to work in the morning, and my mother did actually work, they didn't look in the bathroom mirror and say to themselves, how can I go screw humanity or the planet today? I think there was some plausible denial back then, to be honest with you, Nikki. But I think today through science and the ubiquity of information shared over the internet and social media, that there is no plausible denial left. And that we have to be inclusive. And when you use the word inclusion, people's minds most often jump to inclusion based upon race or color, right? They don't jump to inclusion based upon gender. And that to me is equally as important. And so I think that this arrival, not rising anymore, but the arrival of the feminine at the head of the table, to sit at the opposite end of the table with the masculine, is an uber important piece of this transition. Now, I do believe that our youth are our transition team to a sustainable future, but it's got to be a youth that is balanced between masculine and feminine. And of course, then within masculine and feminine, race, religion, ethnicity, etc.
Wow, thank you. Such inspiring words. I love that. The arrival of the feminine and our youth are our transition team to a sustainable future. It's absolutely amazing. Thank you. And I wanted to ask you to share with us as well, please, how can you be so sure that purpose-driven businesses are the future of business in general and that we can use purpose-driven businesses to change the world? Because I know you have data up your sleeve and would love to hear about that.
Yeah, so the work that we've done both at the university level, at community level, at business level, clearly shows that the future's highest and most sustainable profits will be delivered by leaders who embrace the leadership and management philosophy through the lens of profit for purpose. We're also seeing that it is really likely that the greatest accumulation of financial wealth in the future will be amassed by people who develop innovations and solutions for the social and environmental problems we face. I think that some of that is being driven by what I said earlier about generational shift and generational change. I think we're seeing people get to the age where they're becoming corporate leaders that just have a different mindset, that they just look at life through a different lens. I think that the more women that actually become business owners and the more women that get invested in. Now, it's a crying shame that only 4% of venture capital, I think, last year went to women founders, but I think that's going to change. And we're also seeing inclusion, and I keep coming back to inclusion. It was really interesting for me. So in the 80s, when I would fly for business, we used to have this saying, when you get on the planes, you turn left or you turn right. Obviously, if you turn left, you were sitting in first class. If you turned right, you were in economy. And in the 80s and even the 90s, to be honest with you, when you turned left, 90% of the people in first class were white men. Now, I travel today on business or pleasure, and if I'm lucky enough to use some air miles or whatever to turn left, that has completely changed. I mean, now there's as many women There are minorities, which is fantastic. And so I think these changes, Nikki, are really signaling this shift to a mindset not away from making money. I don't want anyone to think that I'm against making money. I don't, because I think there are parts of capitalism that are fantastic. And but so not against, not away from making money, but actually making more money because you're a good actor. And I think we're starting to see people vote not at the polling station, but with their conscience, as you know, as the title of this podcast is. I think we're starting to see people say, well, wait a second, I don't want to invest my capital in that, or I don't want to buy from that store, or I don't want to buy a product that's made that way. And so those leaders, those business leaders who are prepared to step up and say, we're going to do this differently. We're actually going to rise all stakeholders. And there's a Australian guy, Grant Wilson, who talks about this a lot on Clubhouse, of stakeholder capitalism, of elevating the worth and the value of all stakeholders to match that of financial stakeholders, not decrease, not take everyone down to zero, right? But to bring everyone else up. Those leaders absolutely are going to win out in the end.
Incredible. Thank you so much, Stuart. So, what does success look like to you personally?
I think for me, it will be how quickly, and this is just personal, right?
Yes.
How quickly can we get impact economics embedded in as many communities around the world as we can? So that would be a personal success. And then a success for humanity would be literally for me to see the rates at which inclusion is being adopted around the world, whether that's in commerce, whether that's in politics. It doesn't matter what sector of life that we're in. Being more inclusive of gender, of race, of ethnicity, of religion, of sexuality, etc. That's where I see success for humanity coming from.
Amazing. Thank you. Yes, I agree. And I love how you talk about the power and importance of inclusion and how closely it is tied to our success. It's something I'm so passionate about as well, and really love that that's so woven into the whole concept and how you bring impact economics to various different communities. And so, as we're coming to the end of our time today, Stuart, is there a key takeaway message that you would like to share with everyone?
Yes, I think it's two words: time and compromise. Today, we all seem to be pressed for time, and we make tens of thousands of decisions every day subconsciously, and just things that have just been sort of almost inbred into us in a way, right? Where we just do things and we don't think about it. So I believe if we just take a little bit more time. Now, you can't take time over every decision you make. For example, I just went to reach for my water bottle here, right? That's a decision I made, but it was subconscious. But I don't have the time to sit down and think for 2 minutes, shall I pick that up or not? So I think we should put decision making into three buckets, right? Bucket one, decisions that are going to have a huge consequence on us, our families, humanity, or the environment. Bucket two, decisions that would have slightly less consequence. And bucket three, that those kind of decisions may not have a great deal of consequence at all. Although John Muir did once say, if you target a single thing at nature, you'll find it's attached to the rest of the world. But so I think if we can just take a bit more time to make more conscious decisions about what's in bucket one, it'll be beneficial to everyone. And that, again, could be as little as, where do I invest my capital? Where do I spend my money? And the other part would be compromise. If we don't compromise in our marriages, they can often end in divorce. And if we don't compromise in our friendships, they can often leave us. And if we don't compromise with our customers and our clients, they can go find another provider. And I think what we're seeing today, certainly in America and other places that are becoming so alienated through politics, is we've forgotten how to compromise. So I would sum it up by saying, take the time to compromise. And I think just that little shift would make a huge difference.
Yes, we've forgotten how to compromise. So true. Thank you. And is there a book that you've read recently or one of your favorites that you'd like to share with us?
Oh, I've got many, but I think
I'm sure.
I think for a great book that's an easy read for your listeners, because I know a lot of your listeners are thinking about how to run conscious business, right, et cetera, would be a phenomenal book by a dear friend of mine. His name is Russ Stoddard, and it's called Rise Up. And so for your listeners involved in business that are thinking, okay, how do I really become more conscious in my business practices and how do I benefit my business from doing that? That would be a great read for anyone listening.
Thank you. And lastly, Stuart, where's the best place for our listeners to find you online?
Well, I suppose you can go to our website. I am contactable. You can't get me directly through it, but it goes to my team. So that's www.inplaceimpact.com. I am on LinkedIn. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me on Twitter. You can find me on Instagram. And I do follow back. I am stunned that people that have information or experience play this game of trying to amass as many followers as they can. So, for example, you go look at their profile and it says they've got 40,000 followers and they're only following 2 people. I mean, that to me says that those people absolutely do not care what anyone else has to say. That's what it tells me. And I know people play this game of, I want to amass as many followers as I can, and I'm not going to follow people back because it makes me look more important, right? I'm sorry, that's total rubbish. So I follow back. So if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, if you want to connect with me on Twitter or whatever, you can find me there.
I love that. Thank you so much. And thank you for joining us today, Stuart. It's been such a pleasure to speak with you.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this episode with the incredibly inspiring Stuart. I absolutely love hearing him talk about the rise of the feminine and how important it is that the feminine is in balance with the masculine for us to create the positive change which is so needed for humanity and our planet. It's especially inspiring to hear this from a white man in his 50s. Stuart really is remarkable. You may know that I'm passionate about inclusion, equity, and diversity, and it was really great to hear about how not only empowering women, but empowering all people from marginalized communities and across the world, really enabling them to create their own economic vibrancy rather than putting sticking plasters over deeply rooted problems, is the way forward. Not telling other communities how they need to live and change, but providing some of the capital, knowledge, and resources that can help them to implement their own solutions. No one can do it better than they can. On this topic, I think that Stuart's advice to also have a mentor who doesn't look like you is really inspiring too. It's been incredible getting to know Stuart and how he thinks and works over the last month or two. He has brought a very experienced and grounded perspective to my world and work around how conscious business really is the way in which we can change the world. We can all empower ourselves to make a difference and to empower others around us too. Whilst profit and financial results may no longer even be your driving motivation, these things are still important, and it's great to hear that this measure of success is also going to be the most prevalent, where purpose is the driver. This conversation with Stuart has filled me with a deep optimism for our future we are all creating together, you included.
If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe now. And if you're on Apple Podcasts, please leave a 5-star rating and short review. If you think people you know might benefit from listening to Going Conscious, please share it with them. I know I get much of my inspiration from podcasts which are shared with me. For all episodes, our library and more, visit goingconscious.com. Your support to spread this positive message of fulfillment and freedom means so much. As well as hosting Going Conscious, I help conscious entrepreneurs to transition and unleash their power and purpose with my transformation coaching and conscious brand consulting work. Discover more on Instagram at Nikki Trott or on my website, nikkitrott.com. I'd love to hear from you and to talk about your goals, questions, or how we can work together. And if I don't hear from you before then, see you next Wednesday on the next episode of Going Conscious. As always, live your freedom.